What's going on, guys? This is your host, Madman, and this is part 4 of the Spinoza series of videos, a series that I'm sure nobody is watching, and that gives me great comfort, because the few of you, or the 2 of you that are watching this, are probably the 2 people that need to see it. That's just fate and destiny at work. So, let's pick up. Let's pick up where we left off, which was Proposition 7. So Proposition 7 goes like this. Spinoza writes, "Existence belongs to the nature of substance." So again, he's implying there's some kind of deterministic value to the nature of reality, the nature of how matter exists, how energy exists. Again, you can interpret these terms in various ways. I went over this in the last video. You can, I think I was a bit too hard on myself, to be honest, when I talked about how I was trying to interpret these terms. I think that you can interpret them a little more generously than I assumed you could, because they're pretty vague. They're not very concrete, these terms. Again, 400 years ago. Keep that in mind. So I think I agree with that. I think I agree with Proposition 7. But let's look at Spinoza's proof for this proposition. His proof goes, substance cannot be produced by anything external. And he cites Proposition 6, which, let's quickly take a look at that. One substance cannot be produced by another substance. Again, something that's already been created cannot produce something fundamentally new. It can remix itself, it can decay and grow again, it can clone itself, but the clone will never be perfect. We went over this in the last video. So he's referencing that. So again, substance cannot be produced by anything external. It must therefore be its own cause. That is, its essence necessarily involves existence, or existence belongs to its nature. So, my interpretation of what Spinoza just said involved individual things that were already created and were separate from the sort of base infinity or chaos that Spinoza's now talking about. What he's trying to argue here is that God couldn't make itself, which again is a very sort of circular argument. There's a sort of circular logic to it. It goes back to that prime mover thing, which is, I think, the weakest part of Spinoza's arguments, is that he relies on this kind of prime mover argument, that there must have been an unmoved mover, which in logical terms you can agree or disagree with, but where Spinoza's strengths lie in his argument here is where he leans on mathematics, where he talks about infinity, where he talks about the infinite versus the finite, which is something that he sort of touches on at the beginning, and then he goes back and talks about it later. So if I ever finish this series of videos, hopefully we'll get to that point. We may not, in which case, I'm just wasting my time. But my point with this little rant is that in the first part of this proof, just now I conflated my interpretation of Spinoza's argument with what he's really saying. So what I thought he was saying, and what he has said, I think, in relation to finite objects, is that substance, as he characterizes it, is a kind of immutable thing. It's like energy. Again, he's sort of referencing what we would call in 2025, what we would characterize as the idea that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and that applies to energy as well. Energy cannot be created or destroyed as far as we know right now. And when Spinoza talks about substance, he's talking about something that is, in his terms, according to his time, something immutable. So it's like quarks or gluons or energy strings, whatever the lowest form of matter that we've been able to find. He's saying there's something that can't be changed or transformed. And whether that's God or not, I kind of took some creative license in my prior videos by saying, well, maybe that's what Spinoza's talking about when he talks about God. And again, part of the confusion that I'm experiencing and that you're no doubt experiencing listening to me talk about this is due to the fact that Spinoza clarifies this later on. But let's try to stick to this proof for proposition 6 here. Again, Spinoza says, substance cannot be produced by anything external. So what he's saying again is some version of what we would call the energy/matter can't be created or destroyed argument. That's what he's basically saying. And then he follows from this by arguing that, therefore, substance must be its own cause. That is, its essence necessarily involves existence, or existence belongs to its nature. So again, he's saying there has to be something at the base level of reality that just has to be. It just has to be here for everything else to exist, either on top of it, or as a result of it, or what have you. There has to be energy, or some initial form of it, or some, again, the worst interpretation of this to me, the most annoyingly difficult to defend interpretation is the whole prime mover argument. Well, there has to be an unmoved mover. While that might rely on some kind of logic, I think as much as you can rightly point out that mathematics is based on a basis of logic, which itself transcends both language and logic, the mathematical way of describing this phenomenon of God, to me, is the most convincing. And I'm not a nerd. Again, I'm not a mathematics guy. Maybe that's why this appeals to me, because it's something that's very much outside the realm of my education. But nevertheless, it's the thing that appealed to me more so than any other kind of religious argument. So I'm inclined to talk about it. So anyway, this whole argument about substance, right? Which again we could define as energy, we could define it as matter. In either case, it can't be created or destroyed. And if there's anything that can't be created or destroyed, I think Spinoza's strongest point here is, well, if there has to be some substrate or some bed of chaos. It's a fucking Dark Souls reference, isn't it? Interesting. If there's some substrate of reality, whatever it is, whether it's energy or matter, quarks or gluons, whether it's infinity or some mathematical version of that, there has to be some sort of substrate, right? And this substrate, its only characteristic is that it has to exist. And this goes back to something I said in either the last video or the video before it, where I talked about the idea that even if a flawed human brain can conceive of some creative force that only requires its own conception to exist and doesn't require relationality or doesn't require comparison to something else, and then you consider that every human culture that we know of has required differentiation to allow its citizens to get through the day, so to speak. then again, if there are ideas, objects, forms, whatever, that can only exist by being compared to each other, then there has to be something that doesn't need to be compared to anything. For those other objects that need to be compared to each other to exist in the first place, there has to be something that is an inverse or a mirror, or again, a kind of substrate that provides a conceptual or philosophical or logistical basis for objects that need to be compared to exist in the first place. There has to be something that doesn't need to be compared. Because, and again, this is a very, I hate to admit it, but it's a very binary argument that there has to be something that is independent of the necessity for comparison with something that is not itself to constitute itself or to constitute itself. That godlike thing has to exist for everything else to exist. So essentially, Spinoza is trying to argue all this type of crap that I've just horribly butchered and mischaracterized. But that's how it's how I interpret this proof for point 7, or for proposition 7. So let's move on. Proposition 8. Every substance is necessarily infinite. So again, the term substance in this context is very difficult to translate. Energy and matter are not infinite as we understand them. But if we're again being generous to Spinoza here, what he's trying to say is that there is an immutable basis or substrate or base or rock that the church is built upon that exists so that the rest of reality can exist on top of it. And again, the directionality, that doesn't matter. It's that there's a certain sort of substrate. And what Spinoza is arguing is that, well, substance is necessarily infinite because its permutations are finite. And those permutations couldn't be finite if they didn't have an infinite set to draw themselves from in the first place. And me saying that just now, again, I'm not a mathematician. I know there are greater and lesser infinities. I know there are greater and lesser quotation marks, and I've been making a lot of those. My apologies. My point is that what Spinoza is saying is that there has to be an infinite potentiality for there to be finite potentialities. That might be the best way to put everything in terms of his whole discussion of substance and potential, or substance and, what does he call it? He calls it attributes. So he uses the terms substance and attribute. Yeah. I think, I guess you could say substrate and permutation. Maybe that would be a good way of putting it. Substrate and permutation. In any case, the thing that Spinoza calls substance is sort of infinite potential, and the attributes, or the application of entropy, time, mutation, etc. to that potentiality or that substrate or that infinity. Again, these euphemisms, they don't sound like they're related to each other. It's difficult for me to argue that they are, but I think that Spinoza is trying to get at, again, a sort of basis for reality. It would be like, and I hate to use this metaphor because it's corny as fuck, it's dorky as fuck, but if reality is like a video game, then what Spinoza calls substance would be sort of like the empty hard drive that the game is running on. And as far as we're concerned, it's infinite. But the data that's written on that drive has to differentiate itself. There has to be, if you're looking at a traditional hard drive, right, there has to be magnetic, microscopic mountains on the little disk. There has to be points of positive and negative magnetic charge to differentiate between ones and zeros. And again, the idea of differentiation, that's important. It's constitutive to reality. But if there isn't an undifferentiated substrate or a blank hard drive for that information to be written on, then the differentiated or finite, decayable, mortal, entropy-bound kind of game information couldn't exist, because there wouldn't be, what's another good metaphor? A blank page, for example. If you're going to write letters, if you're going to write any, even if it's a short phrase, even if it's a, sorry for your loss, you have to have a blank page to write that on. That's the infinite substance that Spinoza's talking about. He's talking about a blank hard drive, an empty page, a base infinity, a base bed of chaos, something like that. And again, in Proposition 8, he goes, every substance is necessarily infinite. So every potential page that something could be written on, every hard drive that a game could be put onto or programmed within, has to be infinite. Again, according to Spinoza's and our understanding together, because we actually don't know how infinite reality is any more than Spinoza does. That's the fucked up thing, is as insightful as this guy is, even if we're being generous to him, even if we're applying 2025 colloquialisms to his understanding of his philosophy, the irony is, our terms have evolved, but our understanding hasn't really evolved, has it? Or at least mine hasn't. Really, I'm saying mine hasn't. Sorry, guys. I haven't absorbed the last 400 years of knowledge. Man, if only I'd spent 4, probably more like 6 lifetimes just reading and not breeding. Doing nothing but reading books. If only I could have done that and then appeared before you to explain Spinoza to you. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers the sort of nature of substance and the argument in Proposition 8. But Spinoza has a proof for his Proposition 8. And that's not the Prop 8 you're thinking of. Come on now. Spinoza's proof is this. There can only be one substance with an identical attribute. So one blank hard drive where every part of that drive is blank, to use a metaphor we just explained. And existence follows from its nature, the nature being, in this metaphor, its blankness or its uniformity. Again, pick your metaphor. Could be that it's a blank page. Could be that it's the most basic kind of mathematical infinity or some kind of chaos theory, bed of chaos, right? The quality of that substrate is its uniformity. It's either uniformly chaotic or uniformly empty. It has uniformity to it. Its nature, therefore, involves existence, so it has to exist, we've established that, either as finite or infinite. It does not exist as finite, for it would then be limited by something else of the same kind. So again, Spinoza is circling back to a point we talked about in the last video, and I think also the video before it, points 2 and 3, or videos 2 and 3, excuse me, that a finite thing can only give birth or copy or change or give rise to something that is a derivative of itself. And a derivative is not derogatory, it's just, it's not something greater than its progenitor. A finite thing cannot make an infinite thing, basically. And that goes back to mathematics. Even an infinite set that's drawn from some greater infinity can't give rise to another infinite set that's more infinite than itself. That's essentially what Spinoza is arguing, if you want to take the mathematical, metaphorical way of interpreting this. And again, Spinoza's just doing this with logic. Ace. So again, let's just repeat what we just said. It does not exist as finite, for it would then be limited by something else of the same kind. Again, limited by another finite thing, which would also necessarily exist. So again, for something to make a perfect copy of itself, it would have to also have the necessity of existence, even if it was a finite thing, which Spinoza has implied isn't really the deal. It's not really possible. The only things that necessarily exist are not even infinite, but unfinite. I feel like that's the term he would maybe have chosen to use. In any case, there would be two substances with an identical attribute, which is absurd. Again, we've proven that that's not possible. Spinoza has argued it's not. He's proven that it's not. It, therefore, exists as infinite. Now, what is he referring to as it? He's saying substance. Okay, so yeah, so he's basically saying substance exists as infinite, QED. So again, he's again repeating himself, a lot like I've been doing in these videos. But that's a byproduct of me trying to read this shit. Part of the reason I find this so impressive is how fucking autistic it is. It's like unapologetically repetitive and sort of self-supporting, and very almost machinically logical. Almost like this was written by an AI, an ancient AI. Maybe they had AI 400 years ago. It's just, captured in genie lamps instead of silicon circuits. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe Michelangelo didn't make those sculptures. Maybe it was an AI. That's why they seem so inhumanly precise. That's a Charles Carroll take. But it kind of blew my mind. There's not a lot of conspiracy theories now that really affect me. I kind of went through that phase and came out the other side and was like, 99.9% of this is bullshit. But there's a few stragglers in my brain, and one of them is how beautiful those ancient sculptures are, man. You look at master craftsmen nowadays trying to replicate them with modern tools, and they can't even do it. Almost like it was AI and lasers from a previous incarnation of a technophilic society that maybe got killed by a solar flare. Hope that doesn't happen again. That would suck. But it might. I can't say it won't. What do I know? Anyway, let's move on. So Spinoza has some notes here. Note 1. As finite existence involves a particular negation. Again, that seems like it doesn't really deserve a lot of elaboration, I think. For one thing to exist, it can't be another thing, therefore the other thing can't exist at the same time, or a perfect copy can't exist, so yeah, of course. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's just the first line of note number 1, guys. As finite existence involves a partial negation, not particular, partial negation, and infinite existence is the absolute affirmation of the given nature, it follows that every substance is necessarily infinite. So again, it's another way of arguing or of supporting the existing argument that there has to be a certain substrate to reality, which Spinoza is going to argue is God, or could be called God, or should be called God. Because, again, finite existence involves partial negation. So there has to be something that can be negated for the finite object to exist on its own. Well, what does that really mean if you take that to its sort of logical conclusion? Well, it means that For there to be a whole bunch of finite objects, a near infinite amount of them in fact, there also has to be an equally near infinite or infinite amount of things that can't exist. So that's an argument for the existence of this sort of fundamental infinity, this fundamental substrate of reality for God. There has to be something that can produce from itself at least from our perspective, a functionally infinite amount of distinct different things. But those things, I think what Spinoza is trying to imply here is that they don't just exist because they're different from each other. They exist because it's almost like he's arguing there's like photons and antiphotons. It's like for every object that does exist, there has to be a corollary version of it that doesn't exist. But that non-existent object still has to sort of be somewhere. And again, this kind of argument, it goes back to the Platonic forms conception of ideas, where even an idea that can't be real has to exist in some realm of unreal ideas. And that doesn't mean it's real, it just means that there's a place that contains it. So that means that there has to be this reservoir of every idea that doesn't actually exist. And Spinoza is equating that space not with, our modern sensibilities in 2025, we'd be like, maybe it's dark matter, it exists in black holes, or it's in subspace. We have all these exotic terms. Spinoza just goes, no, that's just part of God. Bit of an oversimplification by our standards, but essentially, according to logic, it makes sense, because he's saying if there's a whole bunch of, from our perspective and from Spinoza's perspective, if there's a whole bunch of finite different things, they don't just rely on each other to exist. They don't just rely on comparing themselves to one another to constitute their individual nature. They also rely on partial negation. They rely on a certain negativity or dark matter or a lack of existence or a Jungian shadow or something. It's not just about things fighting each other forever and intercomparing themselves. It's that there is a non-existent half of everything that exists. Now that sounds fucking Lovecraftian to me, man. That sounds creepy as fuck. Again, it sounds Jungian too. It's like for every living person who strives to be positive and improve themselves, there's a non-living, negative, downward, sort of anti-photon version of that person that's going the opposite direction, that's drilling straight down to hell, proverbially speaking. But all of that is still contained within God. Kind of a creepy idea. There's a certain religion on earth that thinks that God is both evil and good. I don't know if I agree with that, but Spinoza may or may not have defected from that religion. He still seems to be agreeing with it, though. Maybe he just agreed with it on different terms or using different language. That was enough to get him kicked out. What a shit religion. Whatever it was. Anyway, that's essentially note 1. And again, this is all part of the proof for Proposition 8. Not that Proposition 8. This Proposition 8. With that having been said, guys, I think we've gone long enough for this video. We're going to leave it there at the end of note 1. Again, I'm going slow as fuck for these videos because I enjoy it. I like to go slow. Real slow. Slow and steady wins the race, as they say. So, we are going to leave things off there. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy these videos. If not, go fuck yourself. And more videos to come of various kinds and forms. I may go back to Minecraft. I've been thinking about doing a playthrough of something else. I don't know. I don't even know why I'm saying this, because I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want, so I really don't care what your input is. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. But, all that crap aside, I do hope all of you are doing well in your lives. I hope you're weathering the storm as best you can. We're all in the same boat together. And I do think there are sunny skies ahead. This storm will pass like all storms do. So keep your loved ones and your friends close. Stack that cash, motherfucker. And keep yourself healthy however you can. Don't eat too much. Try to eat minimally polluted things. That's very difficult these days, but do the best you can. And as always, guys, peace out.